Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 56 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight will be Acts chapter 23 with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Good evening, Mr. Rabbi Skobac. How are you?
Good evening. Or good morning, where some people might be in the world right now.
Yeah, very true, very true. I caught Rabbi Singer off guard this morning because I said good morning, good evening, and good night.
Yeah, that's true. And I discovered when I'm doing my shows with Jono in Australia, I have no idea what time it is anywhere in the world. So it's just...
That's funny. For some,
hello everybody.
Yeah, for some you're in the future, for some you are in the past. And there you go. Well, good deal. Well, it's good to have you back in the studio for sure. Well, technically.
Yeah.
So it's nice to get another episode under our belt. 56. We are just rolling right along, aren't we?
Yeah, chugging along.
Yeah.
We'll be finishing the book of Acts pretty soon.
Looking forward to it. Romans is going to be a booger. Well, I tell you.
Oh, yeah.
I can't wait. I know. It's like, sorry, we can't put the fast forward on, though. We got to take this one step at a time, right, Rabbi?
We're chugging along.
We are. Very good. Very good. Okay. Well, I'll put the number will be on your screen. If you want to call in, you sure can. 855-95-BIBLE. That's 855-952-4253. Be sure that if you do call in, that you do call in with the topic in mind of Acts chapter 23. Not 22, not Romans, not, no Old Testament question, just strictly whatever this topic is for tonight. Would definitely invite your call. So, all right, Rabbi. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll get kicked off.
So, it seems that these chapters that we're looking at over the past few weeks, it's been a boatload of trouble for Paul.
To say the least.
It's been a boatload of trouble. Going back to chapter 21, Paul comes to Jerusalem, and he's accused twice. He's got these groups of people running after him, and he dodges the first bullet after he is willing to take a test and prove that he's Torah loyal. But then some Jews from Asia start to complain that he's teaching people against the Torah and against the temple and against the Jewish people, and he's brought Gentiles into the temple, and a whole mob gets up, and he's about to be lynched in the end of chapter 21. And he's finally rescued at the last minute by some Roman officers, and but then he asked permission to address the crowd. So in chapter 22, he begins to tell. Last week we went through his whole story, where Paul basically gives them his whole testimony, his whole life, what's happened. And it's interesting that as he's going through the story, no one seems to be upset. When he tells the story of how he was pursuing people who believed in Jesus, and then Jesus appeared to him, and Jesus told him that he's got to follow him. No one's upset at that point. It's only for some strange reason at the end of the story, when he says that he came to Jerusalem and Jesus told him to get out of Dodge, to leave Jerusalem, because people will not accept his message there, and he should go to the Gentiles. All of a sudden, the crowd goes crazy, and they're about to lynch him again. And so again, Paul has to be rescued by the Roman officer, and he's thrown into the pokey. And the Roman officer, for some reason, last week was very intent on getting down to the bottom of what's been going on. And so he, in order to, I guess, clarify what the complaint is against Paul, he has Paul asks to address. It seems here in chapter 23, he's not addressing a mob so much, but a council. And some commentaries think this might have been a Sanhedrin or some kind of a formal group of Jewish leaders, not just the Jewish crowd. And so we get started in chapter 23 tonight, when it says that Paul was looking intently at the council. I guess he was, trying to size them up. And he just begins by trying to clear himself and says, "Brothers, up to this day, I've lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Now, to me, that's not the best defense, meaning that even the worst criminal in the world will often say that I live my life with a clear conscience, because people are easily able to rationalize what they're doing.
Right.
So it's not so important if he's in trouble that he can say, I feel good about what I've done my whole life. He really needs to address the concerns of the people who have problems with him. It's sort of, I think it's the wrong foot. He's getting off on the wrong foot here. It's really, it's not relevant to the crowd how he feels. So to start by saying that I've always had a clear conscience before God, I'm not quite sure that's a good move. And then we're told that the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing next to Paul to strike him on the mouth. That's not very nice. And in verse 3, Paul says to the high priest, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. At least that's the translation I'm working with. And that's, when you think about it, Paul's been in big trouble the last few chapters, and he's about to be lynched several times, and now he's facing what apparently is a hostile, council, whoever they are, and you would think he'd be a little bit more circumspect, and he'd be a little bit more polite. And when when the high priest wants him to be struck on the mouth, Paul says to him that God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Now, it seems that Paul really probably never heard of, or he wasn't paying attention to the teaching of Jesus, that if someone strikes you on the cheek, you should turn the other cheek. Paul doesn't seem to have known that teaching.
That's a good point.
Right? From Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. So what is this expression, you whitewashed wall? It's not the kind of thing that you would say to someone today. But we find it back in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 13, where it's used really as an expression for people that are corrupt and hypocrites. The idea is that something is whitewashed in the sense that the let's say the wall is ugly and disgusting and it looks old, and so you put on just a quick white paint so that it looks nice from the outside, and it becomes an expression for people or individuals who are hypocritical because they look one way on the outside and yet inside they're very different. In Hebrew culture and Jewish culture, there was a Yiddish expression. In Yiddish, they would say "kosher chazer fissel," which literally means that a pig has kosher feet. In that, we know that for animals to be kosher, they have to have two signs biblically. They have to have split hooves, and they have to chew their cud. So all animals that are kosher, generally speaking, actually all animals that are kosher have both signs, obviously. You have to have both signs. So cows and sheep, animals like that we eat, have both of these kosher signs. They have split hooves and they chew their cud. Most animals that are not kosher, like elephants or horses or bears or cats or dogs, almost all the species of animals in the world don't have split hooves and they don't chew their cud. The Torah actually says something amazing. The Torah says that there are four animals that interestingly only have one kosher sign. There's the pig, there's the camel, there's the rock badger, and there's the hare. And the camel and the rock badger and the hare do not have split hooves. They do not have split hooves, but they chew their cud. The pig has split hooves, but it doesn't chew its cud. And so the expression in Yiddish, pigs have kosher feet, what it means is that the pig has kosher feet. It puts its feet out and it shows everyone, look, I have split hooves, trying to show how kosher they are. So outside, the pig has a kosher sign. But inside, the pig does not chew its cud. So the pig has always been the symbol of pretense and of duplicity and of hypocrisy and of someone trying to put on airs that really they're covering up inner corruption. And so that's why the pig has always had a bad rep in Jewish culture, because it really became a symbol of, the kind of person that tries to create an impression that's totally false. And so that's the accusation that Paul levels here at the high priest, that you're just whitewashed, that deep down inside you're corrupt and you're ugly and you're disgusting and you're a liar. But outside, you have your fancy garments and you look really cool. And that's the accusation that Paul throws at him. But it's pretty gutsy for him to say that. You would imagine that he probably was just provoked and he just lost his cool. And so they say, I'm sorry, Paul goes on to say, are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck? Meaning that you're a judge, you're the high priest, you're a big shot in this court, and you're sitting there and allegedly, supposedly judging me according to the Torah, and yet you're violating the Torah by striking me. So everyone was shocked. No one could believe that Paul has the chutzpah to act like this in the court. And they say to him, do you dare insult the God's high priest? How do you have the audacity to insult God's high priest? And in verse 5, Paul said, well, I didn't realize, brother, that he was a high priest. Because it is written, of course, in Exodus chapter 22, verse 28, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. So Paul says, sure, I know that the Torah prohibits saying anything that's an attack, a verbal attack against a leader of the people. I realized that, but I didn't realize that this fellow was the high priest. So many commentaries to the book of Acts say that, Paul really for some reason didn't know this is the high priest he was messing around with, and he apologizes. Basically, he's being repentant here, and he's essentially saying, had I known it was the high priest, I wouldn't have acted so insolently. But some of the commentaries say that he really wasn't being repentant, he was actually being sarcastic. And he was saying, what kind of a high priest are you? He was not really being repentant at all. Like he's saying that you're not acting like a high priest. That's why he's saying, I didn't know this is a high priest. How could I know this was a high priest? Look how he's acting. He's acting like a criminal. So it gets off to a very bad start, the chapter. And what happens is Paul, he seems to be pretty cunning here, because it says in verse 6 that he notices, or he realizes, that in this council there were both Sadducees and Pharisees. And so it says that he called out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, son of Pharisees. So he begins by apparently appealing to the Pharisees in the group, the group that are the Pharisees, and he claims that I'm a Pharisee also. I was born a Pharisee. I was raised a Pharisee. I'm a super Pharisee. And the question is, was Paul really a Pharisee? So it's very interesting that if you go to your bookshelf and you pull down any dictionary, a Webster's dictionary, or any other, major dictionary that's been written over the past 100 years, I've checked about a half a dozen dictionaries. Almost all of them define Pharisee as a self-righteous religious hypocrite. I mean, the most unflattering kind of description of what a Pharisee is. The Pharisee has become a word that means a hypocrite, a pompous, arrogant, self-righteous hypocrite. That's what the word Pharisee means in a dictionary. And it's incredible when you think about how they got that definition. They obviously were not reading anything that the Pharisees themselves wrote. The Pharisees are basically the authors of the Talmud. You have 63 volumes of Talmud, and I don't think anyone who bothered to study it would walk away feeling that these are people that are self-righteous, pompous, religious, bombastic hypocrites. Of course, there were a few, there were some, and they're criticized in the Talmud. But the men of the Talmud, the people of the Talmud, are sages of unparalleled, stellar moral qualities and ethical qualities. And any Christian over the past 100 years that's bothered to actually study the works of the Talmud and the works of the sages and the writings of the Pharisees, that's their conclusion, that these men are incredible people.
Right.
So it's interesting that when Paul claims to be a Pharisee, what does it mean by Pharisee here? If he means by Pharisee a religious hypocrite, maybe he is, because we'll see that during his entire career, as I mentioned in previous weeks, he's willing to do what it takes. He's willing to live by the philosophy of the ends justify the means. And that's not the kind of stellar personality, stellar qualities of a religiously moral, righteous person. Righteous person lives by principles, and the ends don't justify the means. So when he says that I'm a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee, I'm just being cute here. I don't think he has in mind the dictionary definition of Pharisee. But does he mean the actual definition of a Pharisee? What is a Pharisee? So we're going to see that in this chapter, there's some misinformation going on. What we're going to see in a few minutes is that he raises the idea that he's on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Now, I believe that statement is disingenuous and it's misleading. Meaning, is that why he's on trial? Is that why people are upset with him? Because he believes in the idea of that the dead will be resurrected? That's what it sounds like he's saying here. It doesn't seem like he's saying more than that. It doesn't seem like he's saying that he is on trial for his belief that Jesus was resurrected. He doesn't mention Jesus. He doesn't mention a particular person. He seems to be speaking in the general, that I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Not a dead person, but the dead in general. And so it becomes a discussion really about the whole topic of, will the dead be resurrected? And it's so interesting that many Christians have walked away from this chapter assuming that the major difference between Pharisees and Sadducees was concerning this question about the resurrection of the dead. And Paul apparently was being very clever here in raising this question because he knew that the Sadducees did not believe in the topic, the concept of resurrection, and the Pharisees did. And what happens in this next piece in the chapter is a big fight breaks out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the attention is taken off of Paul. But when he says here in verse 6 that I am a Pharisee, so what does he mean? He's not obviously only saying that I'm someone who believes in the resurrection of the dead. When you make this statement, I'm a Pharisee, what you're really saying, if you really mean it, is that you are someone who lives according to the principles and the teachings and the beliefs of the Pharisees. And the problem is that even though the Pharisees may not have had, and I've tried to argue for this during our study of the book of Matthew, I don't know if the Pharisees would have had tremendous differences with Jesus and with the movement of Jesus. They may have had some differences, maybe some differences over particular issues of Jewish law, but those would have been in-house debates. They may have been a little bit bewildered about why Jesus' followers continued to believe in him after his death. But again, that shouldn't have been a deal breaker because, again, since Pharisees do believe that the dead will come back in the future, it wouldn't be totally out of the question for people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah and he's going to come back. But I don't believe that Jesus and his group had all of the theology of modern day Christians. I don't think that Jesus was claiming to be God and that people should worship him as God, and that he claimed that he was going to die for the sins of everyone if they would believe in him, and that the sacrificial system would no longer be necessary, and that there's going to be a New Testament, and there's going to be a replacement of the fulfillment of the Torah with the belief in him, and that the Sabbath is going to change to a Sunday. I don't think that any of that came out of Jesus and his movement. And so Paul, though, we see Paul himself is always at odds with those original followers of Jesus. They seem to have had a lot of suspicions about him, and there was always tension. And we're going to see in the books of the writings of Paul that plagued him his entire career as a Christian leader, that they didn't trust him and they didn't really think that he was teaching properly. And we know that what comes out of Paul is a theology that developed into historical Christianity, which I believe is a radical departure from the original Jesus movement. Just for example, on the issues of the divinity of Jesus, the deity of Jesus, whether Jesus should be considered as God incarnate, and whether Jesus his death atones for the sins of those who believe in him. I think those are later developments within the history of Christianity that emerged, if not directly from Paul, at least from his teachings that were later taken and applied by students of his to mean those things. And so I suspect that Paul, at this stage in his life, was not totally on board with everything that the Pharisees taught. I suspect that if they were going to really have an honest and frank discussion with him, there would be many, many, many serious issues they would have with Paul. And so for him to say at this point that I'm a Pharisee, essentially saying a Pharisee in good standing, he's not saying just that I was born a Pharisee, I was raised a Pharisee, and now I'm no longer part of your group. He seems to be saying that I'm one of you guys. I'm perfectly at one with you. And I really believe that he's being disingenuous here. So when he says in the next breath that I'm on trial for what? What am I on trial for? I think to give the impression that the only problem with me is that I am someone who believes in the resurrection of the dead, and yet, I'm in trouble for that. I think that's really dishonest. I think if you wanted to find someone who's whitewashed wall, it's Paul right here, because I believe that he's on trial for much more than that. So what's interesting is that when some of the Christian study Bibles and commentaries try to unpack this phrase that I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, they don't see it as a general statement concerning the doctrine of the idea that the people who have died will be resurrected in the future. They take it as a statement that his entire trial is based upon the fact that he believes that if anyone in the world, Jew or Gentile, believes in the resurrection of Jesus, they will have eternal life. And the commentaries say that idea is the idea that would really push even the Pharisees over the edge, because these commentaries claim that for the Pharisees, the possibility of Gentiles having eternal life without becoming circumcised and converting to Judaism is scandalous. Now, we've mentioned in the past that that's simply not true. It's a misunderstanding of Judaism, because Judaism never believed that you had to become a Jew in order to have a relationship with God. And so that would not have been something that would scandalize the rabbinic establishment. But I really think that those kind of commentaries are reading into this line. At least the way the line sounds to me is that Paul is making it seem as if this is all a big to-do about nothing. look, I believe in the resurrection of the dead, just like all these good Pharisees do. Leave me alone. And what happens is it starts a fist fight, basically, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees there. And what's obviously bizarre is that if this was only about his belief in the resurrection of the dead, why is there then, later in this chapter, a plot to assassinate him? Because you don't see the Sadducees in this chapter plotting to kill all the Pharisees in Jerusalem. It's not simply because they have, this is all about a disagreement on the hope of the fact that the dead will be resurrected in the future. I think Paul here is concealing, the kind of beliefs he has that really would put him totally outside the camp of both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So what happens is in verse 7, when Paul says this, a big fight breaks out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the whole assembly there got divided, because it says here in verse 8 that the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Now, I'm not clear. I don't think we really have today any of the writings of the Sadducees. So I think that all we really have are some writings about them by people who don't like them too much. So I know that in the Talmud, the only, as far as I know, the only issue that comes up between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is not the issue of the resurrection. Again, I mentioned before that many Christians believe that this is the major difference between Pharisees and Sadducees. That's just false. The basic issue between Pharisees and Sadducees was over the belief in whether there was a revelation by God other than the 5 books of Moses. The basic belief of the Sadducees is that the only thing that came down at Mount Sinai was the 5 books of Moses. And the basic belief of the Pharisees was that at Sinai, Moses received both a written revelation and a revelation that was not written down, what we call the oral Torah. And that was the essential difference between Pharisees and Sadducees. So the chapter here has this fist fight breaking out, and the Pharisees end up saying, or at least it says in verse 9 here, that certain scribes of the Pharisees got up and they said, look, we find nothing wrong with this man Paul. Who cares if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? So they seem to be pretty cool with Paul. And this, again, should get all of us to think back to the 5th chapter of Acts, when Peter and the apostles are on trial in front of Gamaliel, the leading Pharisee of his time, and Gamaliel says the same thing. Gamaliel says, look, there's nothing wrong with these people. Leave them alone. The Pharisees don't seem to be terribly bothered by the people who believe in Jesus. And the same thing seems to happen here with Paul, although I think Paul has been less than forthright in terms of what he really believes. What he's claiming to believe here does not seem to bother the Pharisees too much. And so in verse 10, when this fight became very violent, the government, broke it up basically. A tribune came, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces. And again, as I pointed out, if they had a problem with Paul, if the Sadducees had a problem with Paul, they also would have had the same problem with the other Pharisees there, and they would have wanted to tear them all to pieces, not just Paul. And so they rescue Paul, and they have the soldiers take Paul by force and bring him into the barracks. That's in that's in verse 10. And then in verse 11, we're told that night the Lord, who is obviously in this context here, it's speaking about Jesus, stood near him and said, keep up your courage, Paul, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome. Now the question is, it's actually interesting because I saw this week a Christian television program where this comes into effect. The question would be, did Jesus literally come and stand next to Paul, or is this just merely a vision that Paul has? some kind of a vision in his mind, in his imagination, a dream, or did Jesus actually come and stand next to him?
I think it's kind of
Now,
interesting. The point you brought out was that in Acts it says that there was a couple with him who was there witnessing it, the vision. But in another writing, it says the opposite. He was the only one who saw it. It was just him. So it's like you can't even get two agreeing accounts on what really happened.
yeah, and the question is, what is being told here? You know, um, almost all the commentaries to this chapter, like all the Christian commentaries, insist that this is just basically a vision. Paul did not see Jesus in the flesh here. Um, Although I just mentioned I saw a Christian television program this week, and a woman was talking about the fact that Jesus comes into her living room, literally, standing there and in all his glory. And I've heard many Christians, I mean, it's a little bit frightening sometimes,
Right.
speak about it, an actual physical appearance of Jesus. Not just some a thing in their imagination. Now, to me, I'm not a psychiatrist, or someone that can explain spiritual religious visions, but I think for some people, their imagination becomes so strong, it's as if it's really happening.
Right.
And they speak about it as if it was a real experience. But I think almost everyone reading this chapter, will say that when it speaks here about Jesus standing next to him, it doesn't mean that Jesus literally stood next to Paul here. And I think that, it's just fascinating listening to Christians today and speaking about their encounters with Jesus, and the number of people who speak about their encounters not simply as some kind of vision they had or something that they imagined, but they speak about it as if it was a real experience, and if CNN cameras were there, they would have seen Jesus in their living room. So this is interesting because the language here certainly could be interpreted as a real appearance. So Paul is basically told by Jesus in this story that, look, you're going to have to end up getting out of Jerusalem and going to Rome. And we're told in verse 12, and this becomes really a very disturbing part of this story in this chapter, is that the language is very, very inflammatory. I haven't spoken a lot about the anti-Semitism of the New Testament, and there certainly is a significant amount that certainly has that sound, and this chapter is no exception, because in verse 12, in the morning, we're told the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. So here there's a plot to assassinate Paul, and it turns out that it's not the Jews, but in verse 13 we're told there was about 40 men who formed this conspiracy. And so the problem is that the writer of Acts, Luke here, could have just said that 40 Jews got together and bound themselves by an oath. To be more precise in terms of where this threat to Paul is coming from. And rather than speaking about, the 40 conspirators, we see this expression comes up about 3 or 4 times in the chapter, the Jews. And I think the problem is that the reader, and again, we have to realize that, non-Jews have been reading these stories for centuries, and that's what they've been reading about, not just here in Acts, but in the Gospel of John. It became the Jews. So whereas in Matthew and Mark and Luke, the opponents of Jesus, whether or not these stories were true or not, I mean, I've tried to argue that Jesus probably didn't have that much opposition in his lifetime, and these stories may have been created, but at least the stories that are created speak about, certain Pharisees or certain Sadducees or certain individuals who were upset with him. But by the time you get to the Gospel of John, it's the Jews as a group. And then you're finding this continuing into the book of Acts, where it's the Jews. And again, it appears in the writings of Paul in 1 Thessalonians. I believe it's chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, about the Jews who were hostile to all mankind and killed Jesus. So I think that when people read this, if Christians have been reading their Bible for so many years and just reading about the Jews, it becomes an impression they have of not just certain Jews, but the Jews. So the language here is, I think, very, very inflammatory. And so it says in verse 14 that they went to the chief priests and elders and said that we've bound ourselves by an oath that we're not going to eat anything or drink anything until Paul is killed. Now, when they go to the chief priests, the chief of priests, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, these are generally speaking Sadducees and people that were allied with the Sadducees, because we know that, and we see it in the New Testament itself, that the Pharisees were not really that hostile to the Jesus movement. And the Sadducees would have been very hostile to them because the Sadducees were very close with the Roman government. The Sadducees were very invested in protecting the status quo. The Sadducees were not interested in any kind of movement that was going to overthrow the government, because they were very happy, working in their basically in the temple and being protected by the Romans and cooperating with the Romans. It were the Pharisees who would be very happy to have a Messiah show up and redeem them from the Romans. So it's very likely that the trouble here is coming from people who are either themselves Sadducees or part of the priesthood that are close to the Sadducees, and that's really where the threat to Paul comes from. And again, you go through the rest of the chapter, and it comes up time after time. In verse 20, it's the Jews, and in verse 26, of 27 again, it's the Jews. And basically all that happens in the rest of the chapter, I'm really done here, is that Paul is rescued. It seems pretty strange that they have this huge group of soldiers that whisk him out of town, and they take him into safety. And that's basically the story. And it seems that it's a rather large group to save one person from just a bunch of Jews. They could have had a small platoon, but they seem to have a small army that escort Paul out of town, and they do it under the cover of darkness at night. So that really more or less ends the chapter. That there's this plot to assassinate Paul, and the Romans have to save him. This is the third time in several chapters that Paul's about to be lynched or killed, and he has to be saved by the Romans. And so we'll see in next week how this continues in chapter 24. But this has been nothing but trouble for Paul. Going back to chapter 21, Paul seems to be the guy that everybody doesn't like, and if for some reason he's got a tremendous amount of opposition.
And it seems like he's got a tremendous attitude to himself. I mean, regarding everybody, it's like it seems like he's buddy pal at first, but then if you doubt him in any way, all of a sudden it's like fire and brimstone. So
and I think
childish in a way,
What we're going to see because we haven't read Paul's writings yet, by the way. This is the book of Acts, which is being written about Paul. But when we get to Paul's writings, we're going to see that he's got a tremendous chip on his shoulder,
right, when
it comes to the apostles. He speaks about them in a very sarcastic way because he calls them the super apostles. They think they're, a big deal. And he really has a chip on his shoulder almost when it comes to everybody. And, he's a very fascinating character. So here we see that he's been in trouble so far several times just in these few chapters. And it seems that the accusation that's been popping up over and over is not that he's someone who believes in the fact that people will be resurrected. The accusations were not that he teaches against the Torah and against the temple and against the Jewish people, and he's teaching people not to circumcise their kids and not to follow the laws of Moses. Those are the accusations.
Right.
And those are serious. Those are serious accusations. And he seems in this chapter to have dodged this bullet because he sort of, gets everybody fighting with each other in the council. But he really seems to have pulled a fast one on everyone here.
Well, we'll call him Speedy Gonzalez for the night. Rabbi, it's been a fun show. Thanks for spending all your time with us. You know you love it. That's why you keep showing up with a smile. Shalom, Rabbi. Shalom, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. See you same time, same place next week. Shavua Tov, and have a good night. Take care, y'all.